Everett, Washington. On the night of November 16, 2024, first responders were dispatched to an apartment on Madison Street. Nestor Hernandez Melgar, 29, had dialed 911 to report that his girlfriend, 37-year-old Lindsay Geary, had taken her own life in their bathroom. Responding officers placed him in handcuffs the moment they arrived. They weren't arresting him for murder yet. They were arresting him for being in the apartment at all, a direct violation of an active domestic violence no contact order. This collision of a suicide claim and a documented history of domestic violence forced investigators to look past the scene Hernandez Melgar described and begin a search for a hidden crime. In modern criminal trials, we expect science to do the heavy lifting. We expect DNA and autopsies to provide the absolute, indisputable answers. But here, the science stayed quiet. It took the medical examiner's office more than 6 months to finalize their report. They found Geary had a blood alcohol level of 0.228 and ruled her physical cause of death as asphyxia. But when it came to the manner of death, they checked a box labeled undetermined. The physical evidence offered even less clarity. Investigators processed Geary's neck and the areas under her fingernails, but they found zero trace of Hernandez Melgar's DNA. Geary's own phone added to the complexity. It contained a recent digital search history related to self-harm, providing a factual basis for the defense's suicide theory. This left the prosecution with a significant legal hurdle. They were charging a man with first-degree murder despite an inconclusive autopsy and a complete lack of DNA transfer. It raises the question of how a jury reached a unanimous guilty verdict in the total absence of definitive scientific proof. The law divides courtroom proof. On one side is direct evidence, like forensic DNA. The defense built their case around this side being completely empty. To counter, the prosecution stacked circumstantial evidence, individual facts pointing to a single conclusion, to outweigh the missing science. They began with the physical geometry of the bathroom itself. The rope recovered at the scene measured 7.5 feet long. Prosecutors argued that this specific length made the suicide method Hernandez Melgar described physically impossible within the dimensions of that room. The math of the crime scene didn't align with the suspect's story. The prosecution then turned from the physical space to the suspect's specific behavior on the night Geary died. Phone records showed Hernandez Melgar did not call for help immediately. Instead, he called Geary's mother, then his own. Only then did he dial 911. When officers arrived, the delay continued. It took the suspect over 90 seconds to finally open the locked door. The state argued that this timeline showed a man who wasn't trying to save a life, but was instead using those minutes to stage a scene that would be convincing to a mother over the phone. This left the jury to weigh the defense's strongest remaining evidence, the suicidal search history found on Geary's phone. The prosecution countered this by pointing out the shared nature of the household. 2 people lived in that apartment, and both had access to that specific device. By the time the state rested, the jury was looking at a case where the physical impossibility of the rope and the unnatural timing of the phone calls were pitted directly against the digital search history. The trial at Snohomish County Superior Court lasted 4 weeks. The defense rested without calling a single witness, betting that the lack of DNA and the inconclusive autopsy created enough reasonable doubt to prevent a conviction. On June 22, 2026, the jury delivered their answer. They rejected the suicide narrative and found Hernandez Melgar guilty of first-degree murder, burglary, and violating a court order. The verdict serves as a reminder that forensic science is not the only path to a conviction. A web of behavior and logic can be just as definitive as a DNA profile. Nestor Hernandez Melgar currently remains in county custody, awaiting his formal transfer into the Washington state prison system. Because of the domestic violence aggravators attached to his charges, he is facing a substantial mandatory prison term. Even with the legal case concluded, the medical and judicial records remain in direct conflict. Despite a unanimous murder conviction in a court of law, the official state death certificate will continue to list Lindsay Geary's manner of death as undetermined. Sentencing is set for July 22nd. While the trial is over, the lack of scientific consensus ensures that this hearing is only the beginning of a long process of legal appeals.
Let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a truly baffling case that totally tests the boundaries between circumstantial behavior and hard forensic science. We are looking at the shocking guilty verdict of a man who tried to disguise a murder as a tragic suicide. This is the case of Nestor Hernandez Melgar and the tragic death of 37-year-old Lindsay Geary. We're going to break down exactly how this unfolded, using the very details presented in court to understand how a jury reached a guilty verdict, even when the science wasn't exactly crystal clear.
Now, what's really interesting about this case starts with a simple, but honestly deeply unsettling number, 90. When police finally arrived at the scene, it took Nestor Hernandez Melgar over 90 seconds to just open the door for them. I mean, think about it. In a life-or-death emergency where every single second counts, a minute and a half is an absolute eternity. This delay became a massive focal point for the prosecution. It planted this immediate seed of doubt about what was actually happening on the other side of that door.
Section 1. The 9/11 Call, a timeline of deception.
To really grasp the gravity of that 90-second delay, we have to rewind to the night of November 16th, 2024. This is when first responders found Lindsay Geary on her bathroom floor. According to the timeline, Nestor finds his girlfriend unresponsive, but he doesn't call 911 right away. Instead, he calls Geary's mother. Then he calls his own mother. Only after all that does he finally dial 911 dispatch, claiming she had hanged herself. And then, of course, comes that 90-second delay to let the officers inside. The state argued, quite convincingly, that this simply wasn't the timeline of a panicked partner trying to save a life. This was the timeline of someone actively trying to manage a narrative.
Which brings us to another critical number, 7.5. So a crucial piece of evidence for the prosecution was the rope found at the scene, which measured exactly 7.5 feet long. They argued vehemently that this was simply way too long for someone to realistically use to carry out a hanging in that specific environment. To them, the physical evidence literally did not match his story.
Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Tony Montgomery summed up the state's theory with a pretty chilling observation. She said, "The scene only had to look real enough to fool family, not police, not paramedics." And that was the prosecution's entire argument in a nutshell. The delayed 911 call, the calls to the mothers, the awkward length of the rope, it was all a hastily constructed, meticulously staged scene meant to manipulate the people closest to the victim before authorities ever showed up. Section 2. A history of violence, the context of the relationship. To truly understand how this tragic night happened, we have to pull back and look at the deeply tumultuous relationship between 29-year-old Hernandez Melgar and 37-year-old Lindsay Geary. This wasn't just some isolated incident out of nowhere. There was a clear, escalating pattern of domestic violence thoroughly documented in court records. Police had been called to their Everett, Washington apartment for domestic disputes multiple times. Just 2 months before Geary's death, a domestic violence no-contact order was issued against him. Yet, just 8 days before she died, police were called because he allegedly tried to break into the apartment. And, incredibly, despite that active no-contact order, he was still living there. In fact, on the night she died, the active no-contact order alone was reason enough for police to immediately arrest him at the scene.
Section 3. The forensic gap, science versus circumstance.
Because as clear as the behavioral and historical evidence might seem for the prosecution, the scientific investigation severely complicated the case for everyone involved. It actually took over 6 months for the medical examiner's report to be finalized. When it showed Geary's blood alcohol content was extremely high at 0.228. The cause of death was clear, asphyxia from ligature compression. But crucially, the manner of death, whether it was a suicide, a homicide, or an accident, was officially listed as undetermined. Now, in a murder trial, failing to get a definitive homicide ruling from a medical examiner is a massive hurdle for the prosecution. So, put yourself in the jury box for a second. You have to weigh 2 vastly different realities. On one hand, you've got the prosecution leaning heavily on circumstantial and behavioral evidence, the suspicious timeline, the door delay, the unconvincing rope. But on the other hand, there was absolutely zero trace of Hernandez Melgar's DNA on Geary's neck or under her fingernails. Plus, 7 weeks before her death, she had allegedly sent texts about depression and hanging, and there were searches on her phone the very night she died about ending one's life. The prosecution argued they both had access to that phone, but the defense absolutely used it to build a wall of reasonable doubt. Adding even more to the mystery, investigators later discovered an unsent draft text on Geary's phone over a year later on December 27, 2025. It literally described a dream about the relief of death. It's a genuinely haunting piece of evidence. But again, investigators couldn't definitively prove exactly when it was written or, crucially, who actually typed it, since they shared the apartment and access to the device. Section 4. The murder trial. Dueling narratives in court.
The 4-week trial kicked off in Snohomish County Superior Court on June 1, 2026. The prosecution really hammered home the behavioral evidence. Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Montgomery told the jury point blank, he didn't try to help her because he already knew she was dead. They used his failure to render aid and his total focus on making phone calls instead of life-saving measures as the ultimate proof of his guilt. The logic being, if you find someone you love in that state, your first instinct is to try and save them, not call their mom.
Now, what's fascinating about the defense strategy is what they did not do. Hernandez Melgar didn't testify. In fact, his defense team, led by Public Defender Catherine Bentley, rested their case without calling a single witness of their own. They relied entirely on emphasizing those glaring forensic gaps, the lack of DNA, the documented suicidal thoughts, the undetermined manner of death. They told the jury this was a tragic suicide of a woman battling depression and that the state simply did not have the hard science to prove otherwise.
But despite the defense highlighting those massive scientific gaps, on June 22, 2026, the jury made their decision. They returned a unanimous guilty verdict on every single count: first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, and violation of a court order. And importantly, a special domestic violence aggravator was attached to all of these charges. The jury ultimately believed that the circumstantial behavioral evidence absolutely outweighed the lack of physical DNA evidence.
Section 5. What remains unresolved? The justice system versus scientific gaps. Because even with a conviction, this explainer wouldn't be complete without looking at the strange, unresolved center of this case that still lingers. It forces us to ask a really difficult question. How does a jury convict when science leaves a technical gap? It's a fascinating look at the human element of our justice system. The jury convicted based on circumstantial behavior, the staging, the timeline, the rope, even though the direct forensic contact evidence, like DNA on the neck, was simply not there. They looked at the totality of his actions and decided, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was guilty.
But here is the lingering paradox, guys. Remember, independent of the jury's unanimous guilty decision, the official medical record to this very day still lists her manner of death as undetermined. The medical examiner never officially called Lindsay Geary's death a homicide. It is a striking technical gap between legal justice and scientific classification.
So where does that leave Nestor Hernandez Melgar right now? Well, he is currently sitting in Snohomish County custody. Because of the first-degree murder conviction and the domestic violence aggravators, he is facing a substantial mandatory prison term under Washington state guidelines. He won't be transferred to the State Department of Corrections until after his sentencing. And crucially, legal experts note that a conviction relying this heavily on circumstantial evidence, without direct forensic contact evidence, is exactly the kind of case that generates a highly vigorous appeal. And that leaves him waiting for July 22nd, 2026, just 5 days from now. That is when a judge will finally decide his exact mandatory prison term. It's a moment that will close this initial chapter of the legal process, but will very likely start the clock on a major appeal. It definitely leaves us with something to think about. When a man's freedom is permanently taken away, is suspicious behavioral evidence enough, or should hard science always have the final word? Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me, and definitely keep your eyes peeled on July 22nd to see how this complex story continues to unfold.